Assembly was held its first maiden meeting. This is the first time that the Assembly had existed. It was created by the General Assembly to replace the Governing Council of UN Habitat as a platform for global policy on urban development. The aspiration of the United Nations Habitat Assembly is to be akin to the World Health Assembly, which meets to discuss global health policy. It's going to take several sessions of the United Nations Habitat Assembly to reach that level, but that is the aspiration. And I mention this because the United Nations Habitat Assembly is universal. It involves all member states. It's not confined to a smaller number, as was the case with the Governing Council, 58 members. And it's not confined to supporting UN Habitat as an organization. It is really established to provide ministers responsible for housing and urban development worldwide a forum to advance global policy. A major piece of policy is the New Urban Agenda, which was established at Habitat 3 in 2016, and its implementation is a 20-year project, which we're entering the 5th year next year, 2021. So a major part of the Assembly is to ensure that that agenda is implemented, but it's also to take up issues such as urban economy, aspects of inequality, aspects of environmental transformation, and more broadly, economic transformation. These are issues which the Habitat Assembly is seized with. It is an opportunity also to bring together the various constituencies of the New Urban Agenda, which are not confined to member states. While member states will adopt resolution, and it is an intergovernmental meeting, there is observer status for local governments, for grassroots and informal settlement organizations, for professional associations, of which many on this call are members, who can contribute to the implementation of the New Urban Agenda, and importantly, private entities, including private firms, investors, social entrepreneurs, are also welcome observers of the Habitat Assembly. I mention all this because the organization has evolved, and sometimes it's helpful. I encourage all to participate in the Urban Agenda platform, which was officially launched yesterday, and it is a virtual forum platform that allows for ongoing participation and monitoring the implementation of the New Urban Agenda, sharing best practices and experiences, and it pulls together, Ananthan, you would find interesting, all of the best practice initiatives that have been taking place over the last 20 years in Habitat under one platform, Dubai Awards, etc. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a bit about COVID. Just briefly, UN Habitat has been called upon to lead a process to develop the Secretary General's policy brief on COVID in an urban world. It's the first time ever such a document has been produced on urbanization of the Secretary General, as well as working closely with WHO in the health response and with the Office of the High Commissioner of Refugees. In our efforts to work with both the health response and the humanitarian response, we have also been principal players of the social and economic response within the UN system, so that we are basically bringing the agenda that many on this call take for granted, focusing on urban issues, economic, social, environmental, but within the entire UN system and being part of the COVID response of the UN system. My last point, because my colleague Eduardo Moreno was quite, I think, eloquent yesterday in his opportunities to share with you some of the thinking that the organization is doing in terms of what are the major challenges of COVID in terms of urban development, and making those known to you as a learning process within the organization that will result in a report that examines how cities, the state of the world cities in an era of COVID and beyond. Let me just conclude, since there are many economists and investors on this call, and private sector entities, that the United Nations has established the United Nations Economist Network, of which UN Habitat is an active member. It is led by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs and includes over 200 representatives throughout the UN system. These economists recently put together a publication called Shaping the Trends of Our Time that looked at inequality, demography, issues of inequality, technological innovation, and urbanization. Again, for the first time, the UN system as a whole is taking urbanization as a mega trend that all parts of the UN system must concern itself with. This publication is now available online, shaping the trends of our time. Contribution to UN at 75, which we just heard from the Secretary General. I thank you, Ananthan and others, for inviting UN Habitat participants in this meeting. We look forward to working with you in the future. I hope the rest of today's deliberations are fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for this informative and inspiring message this morning. As you rightly say, the 5 major trends, one of the major trend is urbanization. This is something that we have to really understand and tackle. Otherwise, it'll be too late, as the Economist report says. Thank you very much indeed. And again, as Chris says, let us go back to Habitat website and follow up on the urban campaign measures that's being taken and participate virtually as with the discussion. So welcome everybody again. And then may I then leave the floor to Matti Siemetaki, who is Associate Professor of Geography and Planning and Interim Director of School of Cities at the University of Toronto. He will lead the session from now on in the morning. Thank you very much, Matti.
Good morning, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. We have a very exciting program this morning. So I will help just to curate the program and keep us to time. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak, and I will be politely ruthless with the timekeeping just to keep us on schedule and ensure that everyone has equal opportunity to speak. So first up this morning is Atsushi Kurosawa. And Atsushi is the Director for UN Habitat Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific since 2017. Atsushi, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for inviting me to this golden opportunity to meet you all. And good morning, and to the colleagues in the morning, and good evening to myself. I'm in Japan, and it's already past 10 p.m. So let me start with. I like to put up my presentation. My colleagues, Chris, already provided overall picture of the organization. So what I'm going to do is share my views with for the region. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, we are. Yes, we are.
Okay, let me start. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Building Back Better and Greener. You know, and you are very familiar with this the overall concept. So our regional office is one of 4 regional offices of UN Habitat, and we cover about 42 countries, as you can see on the screen. And we actually implement about 30 or 40% of the whole portfolio of the organization in this region. It's quite natural because this region account for almost half of the whole population on the globe. You're probably familiar with these graphs, and it is extract from one of the UN report submitted to General Assembly. And as you know, on the macro level, the COVID pandemics and the containment measures have plunged the global and national economies into deep contraction. And it is clear that we have lost hard-won development gains in the last decade or so. For instance, it is estimated to push between 70 to 100 million people into extreme poverty, and so on and so forth. So there are many issues at macro level, but as a part of UN system, let me brief you on the SDG, how particularly the region, Asia Pacific region is performing. This is from the UNSCAP report. And it is clear, even before COVID-19 pandemic started, this region, Asia Pacific region, cannot expect to achieve any of the SDGs, as you can see on the screen, if we stay on the current trajectory. So countries were urged to accelerate activities. Now, given coronavirus is affecting almost all SDG aspect, it is quite certain that progress is being further delayed. So COVID-19 is affecting SDG 1, poverty, and vice versa, zero hunger, and health, quality education, gender equality, water and sanitation, and so on and so forth. And 11, as you know, the poor, urban poor particularly, who are living in informal settlements have been affected a lot by COVID-19. And all these affect to the expanding inequalities and so on and so forth. So COVID is actually affecting almost all aspects of the SDGs. If I go to a bit micro level, our country office conducted a survey of the informal settlements in their countries. And this is a result of the survey in Myanmar. Survey for informal settlements in Myanmar. And this graph on the right shows before COVID-19 and after COVID-19. So income level has moved downward. And actually the result shows quite the majority of the household in informal settlements have lost income and jobs, and they have taken loan to buy food. So this is the situation, and this was the result of the survey in May. So I can imagine the situation has been deteriorating since then. I have 5 minutes only left. As Chris already mentioned, Secretary General of UN, Antonio Guterres, issued 20 policy briefs by themes and focusing on particular vulnerable populations groups and focusing on different regions. And among which one on cities and one on Southeast Asia are most relevant to our region, Asia Pacific region. Let me just highlight. One on policy brief on COVID-19 in urban world highlighted or stressed importance of all those issues, particularly tackling inequality is at the top of the agenda. And it is same for the Southeast Asia, among other challenges. So UN Habitat has been implementing the project in different countries, particularly focusing on those challenges, equalities, and strengthen local actors, particularly local governments, and now focus has been shifting in our region to more from immediate response to recovery. Since the majority of the Southeast Asia and East Asia have already passed the peak, whereas South Asia, like India, is now seeing the quite rapid increase of the new cases of COVID-19. So this region, Southeast Asia Pacific region, is showing a quite contrast. Yet, I'd like to just highlight what are the needs on the ground in the countries. As an immediate response, we need to ensure that fiscal spending at local level, and this is still crucial to support medical testing, treatment, emergency response, and support labor, jobs, and living standard, and helping the urban poor, and also national fiscal stimulus package should be complemented with measures for effective devolution of funds for cities affected, and transfers are transparent and responsive to the needs of cities affected. This is more or less kind of need for immediate response, but in the longer term, what we have to do is what we have to aim is build back better and greener, as you already know. And for that, we have to pursue sustainable cities or sustainable development in cities with investment in inclusive and economic resilience and climate change. and keeps the needs of the urban poor and informal workers, as already I highlighted before, at the center of our recovery efforts. And also, we have to prioritize local economic diversification and attract capital projects that build a broader tax base and promote digital technologies or digital transformation. And infrastructure should be for people-centered, developed for people-centered and smart cities. And we have also need to focus on nature-based solutions in urban infrastructures, and so on and so forth. There are many, quite many needs. But before concluding my intervention, I'd like to share one of my favorite stories, which is nearby my city in Japan. This is a story of the one traditional Japanese hotel, which is also cultural heritage. The hotel is in a hot spring resort area, which has been hit twice this year. One by coronavirus or corona pandemic crisis, and the second, the massive torrential rain and massive flooding. So the building was totally devastated. But afterwards, this hotel decided to go for crowdfunding, and their first target was 5 million Japanese yen. I don't know how much it is in Canadian dollars, but it's about 50,000 US dollars. But they have already reached 15 million, over 15 million Japanese yen, showing resilience of their own and good coordinate kind of a mixture of self-help and mutual help that we always think important for recovery of this kind. With that, I'd like to conclude my intervention. Okay, just on time. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Atsushi. That was a great start for our morning keynote addresses. Next, I'd like to turn to Narayanan Edanan. And Narayanan is a consultant in housing and disaster risk reduction with the World Bank. Narayanan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Actually, as a matter of fact, I'm standing in for Narayanan. Dr. Narayanan is not available to make the presentation in person or through the video. So I take the liberty of doing so on his behalf. The paper is entitled The Urban Development Perspectives of Affordable Housing Strategy. To rephrase a famous philosopher, it says that, you know, people have interpreted the housing situation in different ways. But the point, however, is to change it. Everybody recognizes that there is a need for affordable housing. We are celebrating or observing the World Habitat Day with Housing for All as the sort of major theme that we'll be sort of following up for the coming days and weeks. So why hasn't really the Housing for All strategies have worked successfully? In some places it has worked, you know, to the satisfaction of sections of population. So when you look at the, you know, review some of the international experiences, what we see is that there are housing strategies that can be divided into different typologies, like your direct provision of subsidized housing, like Singapore and Hong Kong had tried. Then you have market-based, affordable housing based on credit and other subsidies and private sector. Then you have like China and India have done, then service of land, cash and credit assistance that Cambodia, Philippines, India have tried. Then you have market-based private housing with special assistance, such as the development of serviced land and investment subsidy. Then in-situ rehabilitation. And then you have, for example, the sort of a floor area ratio, etc. Then you have policies that focused on private housing rather than public housing, like, for example, Singapore and Hong Kong and China have tried. So key urban development strategy perspective, you see, all boils down to proper land use control and urban infrastructure, mainly urban transport. it is like this. If you provide necessary transportation, then it is possible to provide housing where transportation is available to people where there are jobs. So then you have also tried, for example, in some ways, the developers build houses without possibility for transportation. Then it sort of creates kind of confusion among how do people really reach the places where they work. Then you have low-rise, high-density housing development model, which means there is self-help incremental housing augmentation possible. That if you have high-rise buildings, there's no way the house owner can enhance the floor space available. You can't put more cantilever balconies. So that is why low-rise is one of the things we can have. Then you have the implementation of appropriate transport-oriented development concept, or BRTS. That is, transport development means you have a provision of transport available, like BRTS that you have in Bogota, the bus rapid transport systems, wherein people are bussed taken to places of work, then they're taken back to their places where they live, so that it does not become a constraint. Then, of course, we have the rental housing rather than owned housing is a more reasonable and realistic option for low-income households. So if you then look at all these different, next one, then when we look at these different options available, so we have this. It's a combination of all this, that is land development controls using floor area ratio. That means how much building you can have with a particular floor, with a particular lot or plot available. So in many ways, then you increase the floor area ratio, then you get more buildings, which also then again puts some constraint on water sanitation and facilities, etc. But that's an option again. Then you have suitable, transport-oriented development. As I mentioned earlier, you have, for example, possibility for people to commute. Then you have low-rise, high-density housing. Like for example, in post-conflict cities, like you have low-rise buildings you build with community help. Then you build a 1 or 2 room house. Then eventually the communities or the inhabitants can expand the area available over a period of time. Then of course rental housing. Rental housing also depends on who will build the rental houses, houses for rent, and all the people capable of paying the rent every month. Especially to low-income groups, people who are living on daily basis, etc. Next one. So, but then you have some limitations of conventional urban growth management. So, demand-responsive development means then you have follow the market demand generated private developers. So private developers then build houses, then they say it's available, go and buy it, you see. But then it is available only for middle and upper income groups and not necessarily for people living in informal areas. There comes the idea of retrofitting approach. Some improvement, you build better houses, you build certain services, but then what happens with this inefficient retrofitting means it does not necessarily prevent the urban sprawl. Then it also does not prevent regularization. If you regularize illegal development as a means of mobilization of revenue, then what happens is more and more illegal developers will keep building on that basis. Then, of course, we have zoning. There is application of land use controls. And so, for example, you have density control based on floor area ratio, but then it can be politically manipulated with the local government. Then we have in India, for example, you have certain guidelines for land use management and also urban infrastructure development. There what you have is, next slide, is the subdivision code. That means the developer should provide basic urban infrastructure, like for example, street network, then at their own expense. The industry should do that in a way. That way you can provide a facility for suburban expansion for a new town. Very often new businesses or factories have practiced this in the UK, as well as in Germany, wherein the houses are built for the workplace by the companies and they provide service for them. Then you have development exaction. That means you provide levy on development. That is, mandate smaller developers to make cash payment to the government to provide services. It is very much prevalent in North America, maybe in Europe, but in developing countries, it is difficult to get money from developers to sort of provide costs for developing the infrastructure or additional basic urban needs. But then, of course, it is very often now used as FAR topping up, means floor area ratio topping up. As I said earlier, floor area means you have a given area of plot, then you are allowed to build on the plot how many floors and how much of area with relation to the plot area available that you can build. That is FAR. So what you do is that if I let you build 2 floors, then in return, you provide for the basic amenities and infrastructure outside the house. So you have, that is what is called as land value capture instrument, which is again very much prevalent in North America, which is also being tried in India and partly in some parts of Asia as well. So what we need is that the value capture is still, land value capture is still an important way of trying to build more houses. At the same time, municipalities and cities can provide amenities. So the government entity needs to deal with private developers in a transparent manner. So government should say, if you are letting you build X number of houses, in return, you should provide this amount of amenities, basic services, etc. So it all depends upon to what extent people are capable of paying rent, or you are able to have, what shall I say, loans for housing loans for these purposes. So to all urban infrastructure, primarily transport infrastructure actually is key. That will start the urban expansion process. Otherwise, you will have sprawling, you will have creation of informal settlements. So transport, especially when we're talking about carbon zero transportation, etc., it is a way in which transportation can be a key element to promote building of more houses and provide, to some extent, address the need for housing for all. So same logic applies to betterment of development levies on any urban infrastructure, although linkage between transport infrastructure and urban expansion is actually most significant. Then we have, as I said, the benefits of value capture is what is value capture is that, for example, given a given piece of land, you're able to generate certain amount of value from that land for using that land to the municipality. So better infrastructure will enable more intensive land use. Then floor area ratio is a strategy. Then you have preemptive public investment, urban infrastructure will create values. Then, of course, for government-owned and developed plots, increased land values can be captured through straightforward auctioning. You auction certain plots of land.
One more minute.
Okay, so all in all, if we go to the last slide, affordable housing development facility receives, we need to have an affordable housing development financing facility established on a country basis or internationally to receive and manage funds from generated through land value capture mechanism. The fund then flows back, the income is then flowed back into the fund for further development. So augmented by shelter fund being established by governments through national development plans, there's a co-financing is a possibility. So what I need is advocating for a housing development financing facility, nationally, internationally, is a way to go to address the needs of housing for all. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Next up is David Agnew, and David Agnew is the president of Seneca College. David, the floor is yours.
Students, alumni, faculty, staff, and partners to welcome delegates to the second Urban Economy Forum. Well, we live in interesting times and you meet in interesting times. And as much as we all want to keep our eyes on the horizon and plan for the future, the here and now, the urgent and the necessary, grab our attention, grab our resources. So it's especially important that you use your time, this more reflective format, not simply to discuss, but to move beyond to an agenda of tangible actions to create sustainable urban economies. And the pandemic has added an urgency to all of this, that trifecta of a critically weakened economy. Growing inequalities laid bare by the differential impacts of the pandemic on communities. A stressed global climate, all underscore the importance of a comprehensive, of a multidisciplinary and inclusive approach. Let me reflect briefly on the role of education, particularly post-secondary education in all of this. You know, one of the lessons relearned in the pandemic was that access to the tools now required to participate fully in education is very uneven. And without that access, the promise of opportunity is lost. A small anecdote. When Seneca went virtual last March, when we had to close our campuses, we offered students loaner laptops, particularly to those who were relying on our computer commons to have access to technology. Within a week, we had 1,100 laptops on loan. And this semester, that's grown to 1,600. Internet sticks as well. And I say this because if we don't get the basics right, any progress we do make will be uneven and inequitable. Access to technology has become as essential as shelter. And let me be equally practical about the role of post-secondary in all of this. You know, I've said that education institutions play a special role in building a more equitable world. We are many things. We're employers, we're teachers, we're gathering spaces, we're social venues, we're community spaces. And we have unique opportunities to model by what we do and how we do it, and the environment we create for teaching and learning. And all of that is very true for sustainability as well. Seneca is a proud founding member of Canadian Colleges for a Resilient Recovery, a group of polytechnics, colleges, and CEGEP committed to, in our programming and operations, contributing to building Canada back better, as we now say. Part of that is providing the workforce that is literally needed to build the economy back more resilient, more sustainably, and more equitably. I congratulate the organizers, I salute the experts, and I wish all the participants in the Urban Economy Forum 2020 a successful and a fruitful gathering. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you for David for providing that video. Next up is Nicholas Yu. And Nicholas is the Executive Director of the Gwangju Institute for Urban Innovation. Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, and greetings to you all. I'm very honored to be sharing this time together with all of you, and especially greetings to former colleagues that I haven't seen for a while. Yes, the Gwangju Institute for Urban Innovation is the thought leader for the Gwangju Award for Urban Innovation, a global award that seeks to recognize innovative ways of solving old, existing, but also future problems. We are co-created with UCLG Metropolis and co-sponsored by C40 and other local government associations, and represent a network of approximately 40 institutions around the world. The purpose of the award is learning. It is not only a recognition award, its founding principle is that most probably the old way of doing things, namely best practices, takes too long. And what we need to be able to do is for cities and local governments to be able to share what they are doing looking forward as quickly as possible, almost, if you wish, in real time. So we work on a 2-year cycle, and we are now just about to enter the 5th cycle, or 10th year, with the award obviously being delayed until next year from this year for obvious reasons. Over the last 8 or 9 years, we have documented and peer-reviewed over 1,000 cases of urban innovation from about 100 countries. And I would just like to share with you today briefly some of the takeaways in terms of how this maps out together with the Sustainable Development Goals and the new urban agenda. First of all, we did already align the award in 2018 with the SDGs, but we've looked at this analysis going backwards to 2016, before the SDGs were even known by cities and local governments at that time. And surprisingly, what we have discovered in looking at approximately 90 cities from some 60 countries is that cities are already implementing the SDGs, but in many cases they don't know it. And what we're trying to do now is to reach out to those cities and say, look, all you need to do is to map out what you are already doing against the SDGs and the principles of the New Urban Agenda. And we found that in many cases where we have tried to help cities do this, it only requires minor adjustments to their ongoing strategies and perhaps also adjustments to their timelines in order to fully align themselves with the SDGs. Of course, not all cities are implementing all of the SDGs. I think it's perfectly natural that cities should be prioritizing which SDGs they need to look at in particular going forward. But another very interesting aspect that we came across looking at these 90 cases is that most cities which are aware that they're implementing the SDGs are implementing up to 4 or 5 different SDGs at the same time. And when we scratch the surface a little bit and we look at this, it's only natural. I think, of course, the official discourse is that all of these development goals are interrelated, but that is an afterthought. They certainly were not written in an interrelated manner. But obviously, if a city is seeking to lower its carbon footprint, it will have to look simultaneously at water, energy, mobility, consumption, and waste. But another interesting aspect is that we are seeing cities tying sectors together that normally are the absolute silo. So, for example, tying education together with production and consumption. Let me give you one example. Milan won the Guangzhou Award in 2018 for its food policy. Now, one of the major impacts was achieved when they decided to change the procurement system for all the institutional meals. That includes all the schools, all the hospitals, the prisons, and all the official local government run cafeterias. That single act of changing the procurement to local procurement and organic food stuffs changed within, in a very short period of time, the production pattern. All of the farmers within the immediate vicinity of Milan changed their production patterns in order to respond to this change in procurement. So it just shows that a city can have a major impact on what is going around in its immediate surroundings if it looks at across sectors. Right? So it was quite a surprise that the biggest impact was achieved through a change in the food policy of the educational sector. Another interesting aspect that we have discovered is that cities are quite often today addressing issues that fall outside their traditional mandate. So here is a finer sample. We took the sample of 45 deserving initiatives, peer-reviewed initiatives from 2018. We discovered that 15 of these 45 cities were addressing economic growth, SDG 8. 15 of the 45 were also addressing SDG 9, industry and infrastructure. 16 of the 45 were addressing SDG 10 on inequality, 11 on peace, justice, and institutions, 13 on health, and 9 on climate change. And I'm not talking about climate adaptation, I'm talking about climate mitigation. So we looked at these much more closely and said, what is going on here? Because in the majority of the countries where these cities came from, these are not within the purview of local government mandates. Most local governments around the world do not have a mandate to deal with economic growth, nor industry, nor peace and justice or health. So upon a closer look, we found that basically when interviewing these cities and regions is that we found a lack of national policy. Basically, what is happening is cities and regions are filling in gaps in national policy. And this was very clear in the case of, for example, Surabaya, where they also won the award in 2018, and their approach to what initially was a waste problem, but rapidly became an energy problem, a mobility problem, an industrial problem. And so basically, what Surabaya did was start a campaign to reduce, recycle, and reuse waste, but it very rapidly showed that cities can do much, much more than what the existing national policy is addressing. And in this case, Surabaya has influenced the national policy on waste, energy, and mobility as a trivalent approach. So basically, to conclude, what we're seeing is that we're seeing, I think, two very interesting outcomes. One is that cities are really taking the bull by the horns. They are doing things way beyond, and we know this already from many cases, they're going beyond what national governments often are trying to achieve or to do. But also they're doing this by going outside of their traditional mandate. And the other second major conclusion is that I think we are on the verge of approaching what I can call a systems approach to sustainable urban development. And this is largely due to a awareness that in order to make real change, you have to change your governance systems. This was both the case in the cases I mentioned, Surabaya and Milan, where they really changed the way the departments work within a city or regional government by breaking down silos, building bridges between silos, overcoming the traditional problem of competing but non-communicating jurisdictions. So I think this is some of the major takeaways we have. We will continue to do this for the next round in next year in 2021. Hopefully bring the results to the high-level political forum if we can meet physically. And what we mean by bringing the results to the forum is not just to bring the result of our research to the forum, but to bring the actual cities to the forum so they can tell their story on how they're doing things. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And for those of you who are interested, you can contact the Institute at any time. We'll share the publications that we have.
Thank you, Nicholas. Fascinating talk about how cities are moving beyond their national governments to make interventions that drive change. Our last keynote speaker for this first morning session is Ali Aruf. And Ali is an architect, urban designer, and urban planner at the University of Doha in Qatar. Ali, the floor is yours.
For me, I am unmuted.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect, perfect. And I want to share my screen, please. Can you allow me to share my screen?
Alex?
Yeah, should be free. If there's technical difficulties, you can email me the PowerPoint, or you could drop it in chat.
Is it available now? You can see my screen now?
No.
Okay.
If there's issues, maybe Maddie, let's move on to the next keynote.
Actually, Ali is the last one for this session. Ali, do you want to start speaking with?
It's here now. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Ali.
Perfect, perfect.
There we go. Perfect.
And let me, So I am really honored to be here. And then for the sake of time, I know that I'm the last speaker, so I want to really jump into my main thesis here. And as you can see in my title, I'm suggesting that we have to say no to the new normal and say yes to normal. And I will try to share with you some of my sort of reflections regarding what I would call it the inevitable paradigm shift. I think this term, new normal, needs to be contested, needs to be interrogated, because everybody now is kind of preaching us that we need to go for what is called as, because of COVID-19, a sort of a new way of life. And I would have a hypothesis regarding that actually we need to go to the normal situation that we missed, that we forget about for long number of decades. And I think COVID-19 alerted us to that. So with that said, I want to share some observations and reflections. And I do believe in the notion of exceptional times need exceptional decisions. And also in exceptional times and harsh times, this is the time where we see the manifestation of human power, the manifestation of human creativity. One of the major observations is related to the notion of globalization. We also realized because of COVID-19 that locality is important, that looking within our community, within our family is also as important and crucial as the idea of how to globalize our cities, how to make Doha looks like New York, and so on. Another very important idea is related to how we deconstruct and construct our environment. And again, COVID-19, as this cartoon to the right hand of the slide shows you, before COVID-19, we were consuming our environment. We were having a sort of a distorted understanding of growth. And suddenly we realized that our cities would be occupied by animals coming from the adjacent forest. And because we have to go for our quarantines, and we had the opportunity to give the environment a different way to breathe and heal. Another interesting observation related to the notion of isolation, the notion of being alone, the notion of that people for the very first time in their contemporary history were forced to be detached from being social animals. And suddenly all of us are sort of isolated alone in our houses and dwellings. And this, in my opinion, created what I've called the concept of fear. Fear from isolation, but more importantly, fear from the other, which is antithesis to the whole notion of urbanization, antithesis to the whole notion of being together, the notion of community, the notion of society. And that was manifested in a lot of great places around the world, from the major historical places to the most important public places that suddenly, like the case of the Alexanderplatz in Berlin, is becoming a sort of a deserted place, even holy places and spiritual places. All of this has suddenly became a sort of vacant places, deserted places. And we cannot replace this by having a sort of second life communication. We know that we are in a sort of a paradigm shift. We're Zooming every day, but this has nothing to do with the idea of meeting each other and talking to each other and looking into the eyes of each other. I think one of the interesting observations also that COVID-19 helped us to understand is that we need to rework our priorities and roles. Suddenly we realize that nurses are important, medical teams are important. Those guys put their lives on the front line to help us, to help other cities and communities to go beyond COVID-19 and its deadly impacts. But also, we have to understand that not everybody can afford isolation. Not everybody can afford quarantine. So the idea of just cities, the idea of equal opportunities, here this wonderful lady can afford to cover the mouth and the nose of her dog. Other people in other places cannot do that, cannot go for the social distancing. Some people in some other countries, they have to go on a daily basis to the street because this is the only way by which they will put food on the table. And therefore, we need here to see the sort of disparity between cities that can adhere to what we called isolation and so on, versus cities that cannot afford to do that. And therefore, I think COVID-19 helped us to create this sort of a new canvas, a sort of a new page that can help us to sort of structure and construct this new paradigm. One feature of this new paradigm, as I sort of envision it, is related to the idea of moving from planning cities to building communities. Community are a very, very important component, and we need to design for them, plan for them, but more importantly, we need to make sure that they are engaged in the whole process from envisioning to the actual implementation. We need also to consider the notion of the size of the city, the scale of the city. Is it the time now to revisit the concept of mega city and metropolitan cities and move again to the notion of urban places and urban villages? Contemporary cities and the housing dilemma. We were forced to be isolated in houses and apartments where people were suffering from no interaction with nature, crowdness, severe kind of architectural treatments that made their isolation period almost as if it's a punishment. So even very small elements like balconies can afford a wonderful relation between people and nature. Open spaces also is becoming absolutely important and crucial, because in the time of quarantine and COVID-19 impact, we did realize that people want to go out. People want to have positive relation with the environment. People want to see and to be seen. Another interesting idea is related to the rhythm of the city. Do we need to go back to a sort of a slow city momentum? We are all the time sort of squeezed in the streets where you have a lot of traffic and noise, and you cannot have the time to socialize with your neighbor, to meet new friends. So maybe the slow city would win. And the final point regarding fundamental paradigm shift transformations in educational process, we need to sort of go for a more realistic projects related to the actual needs and aspirations of the society and the community, and to plan, to prepare the planners to participate in projects that can help and enlighten civilization and knowledge. I would end up by saying hope is beautiful. We don't need a new normal. We need to be just a normal. Thank you. This is Ali Al-Raouf, and you can find also my email. It was a great honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ali. What a hopeful and optimistic message in a moment that can feel sometimes overwhelming with sad news and in some cases despair. This must be a new record. We're actually ahead of time. Let me make then a few just concluding remarks that try to tie together the themes of the presentations. And let me start with some reflections on Ali's comments, which I think really tie together the feelings that many of us have at the moment, which is that simply a return to the old normal is not only not appropriate, it's actually an abdication of the responsibility of the moment that we have. David Agnew talked about a trifecta of crises relating to public health, to the environment, and to social equity and racism. And Ali's presentation puts into sharp relief what a new normal has to entail of creating cities that are more equitable, sustainable, and just, by starting at their foundations of how you build communities. That this isn't about city building, this is about community building at its core. I was struck in Nicholas's presentation about the ways that cities are in fact breaking down silos. I think that that's such a powerful idea, that that it's cities that are leading. And we've known this for some time, but perhaps in our the rush of activity in our old normal, we lost sight of that. And I think Nicholas's presentation really highlights the ways that cities are driving for our drivers of change. David Agnew's comments, I was struck by the example he provided of the way that Seneca College responded to the issue of inequality amongst their own students, and bringing forward the policy of giving out laptops. You know, in one way of thinking about that is it's a huge risk. That, you know, 1,100 laptops is a significant amount of capital, and you're now handing them out and doing that fairly quickly along with the internet sticks. And yet they found a way. In many ways, it's symbolic of the approach that cities have been taking to tactical urbanism since the pandemic struck. That our cities moved at a pace that, in many ways, perhaps could have never been envisioned before. Just here in Toronto, as one example, the city implemented bicycle lanes on one of our major streets at a pace that politically and institutionally could never have been envisioned. That the plans that were implemented had been on the books for decades, and within the span of weeks and months, they had them implemented, and they're beautiful and being widely used. And David's example is a similar model of what can be done when people think tactically and think about how you deliver initiatives that help those who are most vulnerable and need a response quickly. To Ali's point, we can't wait. We're in a moment of crisis. We need to move fast. Atsushi's comment, I think, reinforces this focus on need and who needs it most, and that even the experience of COVID and the impacts of COVID are widely divergent, and folks in informal settlements, people who have to go out, are the most impacted. And his comments about loans and taking on loans to meet basic necessities really just reinforces how there are at least two experiences of this COVID pandemic and this health crisis and its knock-on impacts on the economy. And I think a laser focus on as we build back towards a new normal and create a new normal together, that really puts a focus on inequality and leaving no one behind. And finally, Anantha's comment got me thinking that now that we have this path towards a more hopeful and optimistic future, we need to figure out how to pay for it and how to deliver it. And you know, that our roles as urbanists in many ways are coming up with visions, bringing people on board, coming together, and then we need to figure out how to move these plans. And making big actions takes financing and takes, in many cases, big money. And we need to figure out what the models are in a new normal that cities can use in order to pay for infrastructure. In some cases, the infrastructure is small scale and tactical, and maybe we can move away from trying to see every problem as being solved with a mega project. But in other nevertheless, when it comes to the scale of challenge with issues like affordable housing, clean drinking water, a lack of infrastructure, these are major multi-billion and trillion-dollar investments that are needed, and the funding that is going to be required in order to make this move to achieve the SDG goals is going to be substantial. Cities in most countries have the least amount of revenue-raising tools, although they provide the most amount of services. This is a moment, in this moment of rethinking, when we're thinking the what, we also need to be rethinking the how. Part of that is how we bring communities together. The other part of it is thinking through how we pay for all of the good work that we've been talking about here. So with that, I want to conclude by saying I think we've been left with a lot to think about, and also a path that is optimistic and hopeful. And I think in this moment, it's important to reflect on both the challenges we face, but also perhaps brighter futures ahead. Thank you again for attending this first session. It's a great way to get day 2 of the forum started, and I'll now turn it back over to Alex and the forum organizers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. So we do have a break scheduled for this time. And as we are on time, we will take that 5-minute brief break, quick quick
Get your coffee or something.
break. Yeah, coffee or something. And we'll meet back here within 5 minutes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you again. Thanks indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Can we reconvene, I suppose?
Yeah, let's do it. Reed's
Yes,
here.
good morning, everybody. Are we all, have you all so energized ourselves with coffee or tea or whatever you want to have? And then maybe then we could start the second part of the morning session that will last from 10:10 up to about say 11:15 or 11:11. So I would then just like to again thank everybody for attending the first session, and yeah, there are a lot of thoughts for action, as well as actions have also been presented in the form of interesting description of case studies and experiences. So this session will be led by Reed McAlpine, who is a counselor of city of Markham. It's for those of you who are not from Canada, it's a regional municipality. Markham is a town in the regional municipality of southern New York in Ontario. It's about 30 kilometers northwest of the center of Toronto, and it has about 330,000 people population. I think I'm not wrong. So I think it's important that this session is being led by a person from the municipality itself. I leave the word to Mr. McAlpine. Here you are. Red?
Yeah.
Hello?
Good morning. Good
Yes.
morning, and thank you for that. I'll just add one other thing about the city of Markham, which I think makes it a little bit unique in that, I just received this data yesterday, actually, 70% of the people of Markham were born outside of Canada. So it's an extremely diverse city, growing extremely fast and facing all of the pressures that come along with that. So hence my interest in a lot of the work that the Urban Economy Forum deals with. So I'll start this morning. We have 6 speakers, and as we did earlier this morning, we'll try to limit everybody to 10 minutes and stay on time. We did a good job of that earlier this morning, so if we can keep to that, that would be great. The first speaker this morning is Ted Howard. Ted is the co-founder and president of the Democracy Collaborative. Previously, he served as the executive director of the National Center for Economic Alternatives. Ted lectures frequently about community wealth building. In 2010, he was appointed the Stephen Mintner Senior Fellow for Social Justice at the Cleveland Foundation, a position he held for 4 years. Ted, I'll turn the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Reed. I bring you greetings today from the city of Denver, Colorado, in the United States. Today, I'd like to speak with you about an emerging form of economic development that is known as community wealth building. We all know that cities are essential if we are to succeed in delivering on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But cities will not be able to do this without strong local economies. I recently moved to Denver from Cleveland, Ohio, a city that is struggling to rebuild itself from its days as a declining industrial urban area. Denver and Cleveland are very different. They have very different histories. One's a weak market, one's a strong market, but they share some of the same underlying structural problems and have used some of the same failed strategies to address them. Those strategies are familiar to us all. Speaking at least in the US context, but I suspect this is relevant to many of you living in other countries. Much of what we call economic development these days in urban areas is in fact a zero-sum game, predicated on a neoliberal concept from the early 1980s that markets must reign supreme, that ownership patterns over capital don't matter, that rooting jobs locally is irrelevant in a global economy, and that the benefits of growth will surely trickle down and lift all boats. But in places like Cleveland and Denver, this paradigm of economic development has manifestly failed. Fully 30% of the population of Cleveland, for example, continues to live below the poverty line, despite many decades of traditional economic development and many tens of billions of dollars spent. We need to move beyond economies that are shaped and driven by the needs of capital and investors, and where labor, working people, are simply considered a cost on the balance sheet. There must be another way forward. At my organization, the Democracy Collaborative, indeed, we believe there is one that centers the economy around people and their needs and the communities in which they live. Community wealth building, the process of developing local assets and institutions in ways that ensure wealth stays local and is broadly shared, emerged more than a decade ago to challenge the underlying logic and failures of this trickle-down economic development under which we labor today. Last year, Marjorie Kelly and I wrote a book about this called The Making of a Democratic Economy, Prosperity for the Many, Not Just the Few. The book tells the story of people and communities across the US and in the United Kingdom who are working to build a democratic economy using tools of community wealth building. Let me share a couple stories that inspired the writing of the book. In Cleveland, where I lived for the past decade before moving just a month ago to Denver, the city government, local philanthropy, and major anchor institutions decided to try a different strategy than the traditional economic development. And so they partnered together to localize procurement of big institutions in terms of their goods and services, renewable energy production, food production, healthcare, bed, linen, laundry services, and so forth, and use this local procurement to help capitalize and stand up a network of for-profit, worker-owned, community-based green businesses known as the Evergreen Cooperatives, which now employ several hundred workers and a growing number. This business network prioritizes family-supporting living wage jobs, profit sharing, keeping money in the community, and hiring from local neighborhoods. Typically, people have been left behind, unemployed, and many with criminal records in their past. In Preston, England, inspired by what has taken place in Cleveland, an older industrial city that was once known as the suicide capital of the United Kingdom, the City Council of Preston has driven a comprehensive community wealth building strategy, including repatronizing anchor institution procurement that has returned more than £70 million to the local community, public employee pension fund investment on High Street, not in the City of London, to the tune of £100 million, partnering with the local university to incubate cooperatives, and capitalizing a publicly owned bank using reserves of the city and county. In just 7 years, this strategy has saved or created several thousand jobs in Preston, and a city that was once in the bottom 20% of the country's most deprived communities has now been named by PricewaterhouseCoopers, hardly a radical organization, as the most improved community in the nation for 2 years in a row. The Preston model, as it's called, is now being replicated in various ways in dozens of towns and cities in England, and has helped stimulate much larger strategies to address the fallout from the COVID pandemic economy in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Because of the early successes of places like Cleveland with Evergreen and Preston in the UK, community wealth building has grown from a simple idea, the idea that whoever owns and controls assets and capital determines the type of economy we have and who benefits from it. And it's grown from that simple idea into the beginning of truly a global movement to transform the practice of economic development. Today, numerous community organizing and development organizations, as well as philanthropy, has used community wealth building as a framework for their programs. Several American cities have now, for the first time, actually established in their municipal structure offices of community wealth building. Many other cities are now financing key elements of community wealth framework, worker co-ops, employee ownership, public banks, land trusts. The city of New York, America's largest urban area, has just issued a full-blown strategy centered on policies for municipal community wealth building that are now being implemented. Meanwhile, anchor institutions, universities, hospitals, cultural centers, the kinds of institutions that don't get up and leave, that stay rooted in place, across the United States, particularly health systems, are beginning to really leverage their economic power to benefit the locality, localizing purchasing, hiring, and investment practices to build wealth in their communities. Recently, a group of health systems we work with in the US announced that they were taking initially 1% of their investment portfolios, no longer placing them on Wall Street, but investing in their local communities to create jobs and opportunity. And that 1% alone amounted to $700 million of investment in these 16 communities.
Okay, if we could wrap it up quickly. Thank you.
Yep, sorry, my clock says I've been going for 7 minutes, 50 seconds. So let me just end then with a few thoughts about the relevance of the community wealth building paradigm of economic development. While some hope that we'll return to the status quo of the past, the status quo has disappeared. Here in the US, one recent business survey has found that close to 100,000 businesses are already closed permanently due to the pandemic. As many as 42% of the tens of millions of people who lost their jobs in the US in the COVID economy are projected to not be able to return to work. They won't have jobs. So we now must choose. We can either allow ever more concentrated local economies and Amazon recovery, if you will, or we can lay the groundwork through community wealth building for a truly democratic economy moving forward. So let me just close last sentence with the words of the great physicist and Nobel laureate, Albert Einstein, who once said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Never were these words truer than today. Let us think and act newly and boldly together to deliver on the sustainable development goals agreed to by the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ted. That was much a fascinating talk about community wealth building, and I think a lot of us can take a lot away from that, for our own situations. I'd next like to introduce Lane Robinson. Lane is the head of social policy development at the Commonwealth Secretariat. His work on social policy focuses on youth, education, health, and gender. He also provides technical advice to the Commonwealth member states and works with numerous organizations to improve the lives of Commonwealth citizens. Lane? Is Lane Robinson here?
Yes, I'm on mute now. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for this opportunity to share in this important session. I will focus on the importance of integrating youth perspectives in policy plans and programs aimed at making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. I have a 4-year-old son, and we talk a lot about nursery rhymes. And one of the nursery rhymes that I've taught him is Humpty Dumpty. But a few days ago, he said to me, "Daddy, why is it that all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't somehow put Humpty together again?" And it started to come to my mind that in many ways, human societies have been struggling with the very same issue, with the challenges we are facing. How do we, the best minds that the world can produce in this meeting, sometimes outside, how are we unable to put together the challenges we face and solve the problems we are faced with going forward? In this session, I would hope to speak to and share ideas that I think may help in our conversation going forward in terms of how do we make societies and urban spaces more whole, more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. If we were to ask our young people in the cities and urban centers about their hopes for the future, what would we hear from them? Would we hear from them hope, optimism, or would we hear fear? What about our actions to inspire young people and their hope for the future? The data suggests that in human societies, in human history, we may be leaving our children a world, leaving our children and our young people a world that is worse off than the one that they inherited, the one that we inherited. We're leaving for them a world that is worse off in almost every way. In terms of the environment, in terms of the economic infrastructure, in terms of how society is cohesive, we may be leaving a world for them that is worse than the world that they inherited from us. The Sustainable Development Goals reports and successively from 2018 have been telling us that young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults, or that there are over 617 million children and adolescents who 58% of them are not going to achieve minimum proficiency in reading and mathematics. In the Commonwealth, we have over 60% of our population being young people, but alas, most of them will not be able to secure the kinds of jobs they have because of the skills mismatch we see in the labor market, indicating that the education system needs to do more if we're to deal with some of these challenges among the young people for the future. We also know that girls are more likely than boys to never set foot in a classroom, despite efforts made over successive decades to do this. And so when we talk about a crisis, yes, we are having a health crisis. Yes, we're having a pandemic right now, but we have been having a youth unemployment crisis for many, many years now. And that challenge remains with us and has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Just yesterday, I got an email from a mother her daughters just graduated from a top university here in the UK, here in London. And she has done an internship. She's done all that she's been taught to do. But the mother wrote to me and said, can we find something to respond to her need because she can't find a job? These are horrible times, she says, for new grads. No work available. We hear talk about the COVID generation. We hear talk about the generation lost. What can this meeting do for the young people? In this session, I perhaps will share 3 thoughts for our conversation. The first one is, of course, we need to implement. There's no loss of great ideas, but I think we're having an implementation challenge. We have so many rich ideas that are just sitting around not being implemented to the scale that they need to be to make a difference. I will share perhaps 3 of them. The first one is what I call the youth mainstreaming strategy. Mainstreaming for us in the Commonwealth are a set of strategies that are intended to speak to intergenerational equity and injustice, that enables young people's perspective, their capabilities, their rights to be integrated into the design and implementation of programs and policies. We believe that if you integrate youth perspectives into design and planning around urban city spaces to make for more resilient spaces, you will be allowing young people to benefit equally from and contribute equally to the development outcomes in our cities and urban centers. And mainstreaming has many benefits. Of course, it allows for long-term sound outcomes over the long term. Of course, it allows for greater efficiencies and growth. Of course, it allows for social cohesion. But it does more. It allows for cross-sectoral collaboration and coherent strategies that meet holistic needs of young people. It allows for the harmonization of policies across both vertically and horizontally at different levels of our urban centers. It allows for appropriate youth participation mechanisms to do well and to integrate with decision-making processes at the appropriate levels. And so youth mainstreaming, rightly applied, is inclusive, it is consciously proactive, it places young people at the center of our planning and thinking, and it transforms legislation, policy, and programs by applying a youth-centric perspective. But perhaps more than applying a youth mainstreaming strategy is our attitude and approach. What is our attitude and approach in integrating young people into the development thinking and planning? Perhaps I'll mention those 2 here. Is it a deficit approach or is it an asset-based approach? In the deficit approach, we see young people as problems. In the asset-based approach, you see young people as solutions. Just 2 other thoughts as I conclude this today. The first is, are we considering investing in the people who support young people in our urban centers, youth workers? We have done studies that show that our youth workers are not nearly valued and recognized for their contribution to development planning. The best advocates for young people are young people themselves. But the second best advocates for young people are those practitioners who work with young people. Are we investing enough in them? And then finally, as the time is about to run out, I think the third big idea here for conversation is investing in evidence-based policies and programs. You know, when we talk about youth development, we have done the work through our Youth Development Index, which is a global tool that we use to track the progress of young people over time. And what we have found is that there's not nearly enough evidence on what the youth development sector needs. There is not enough monitoring on what does good youth development look like. If I were to ask in the various cities and towns and urban spaces, how do you know that youth development is progressing or not progressing? Those indicators for success are not nearly measured enough across enough of our spaces in urban centers. And so our thought is that we need to invest more in the evidence-based youth policies, invest in getting that data on youth participation, invest in getting the data on things like youth and the digital economy. That data is still not readily available. Invest in getting information about how young people can get into jobs. That data sometimes is not nearly as accurate as it needs to be to guide decision making. And so if I should conclude today, one, we have a challenge before us with the youth populations across all urban centers. Two, it's a difficult challenge in putting our societies together, putting Humpty together again. But that challenge can be overcome if we apply our minds to implementation. And perhaps in this youth development discussion, do three things. One, invest in a mainstreaming approach, integrating youth perspectives across a number of sectors, both vertically and horizontally. Secondly, invest in youth work, the people who work with young people. And then thirdly, of course, make sure that we are investing in evidence-based youth policies that are driven by, not by our thought and feeling that, oh, we were what it was like when we were young, but policies that are guided by data that clarifies the problem, that shapes our decision-making with those problems, that assess the implementation, and more importantly, gives us a monitoring of those results over time. I want to say in conclusion that our cities and urban spaces can be inclusive, can be safe, can be resilient, but we can only do this if we also think about including young people at the heart of these decision-making processes. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that we will have some more discussion about how to integrate young people into this conversation as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Lane. I think that's a really important perspective that you've brought to us. Certainly where I come from, the focus is often on our seniors population, and I think in that, as important as that conversation is, the youth perspective often does get left out, and I think it's really important. And I think that's actually quite a nice segue to our next speaker, Gil Penalosa. Gil is actually one of my sort of local heroes, if you will. He's very passionate about creating cities for all people, vibrant cities and healthy communities for everyone, regardless of age and social, economic, or ethnic background. Gil is the founder and chair of the internationally recognized Canadian nonprofit organization 880 Cities, although his roots are in Colombia. He is also the first ambassador of World Urban Parks. He holds an MBA from UCLA's Anderson School of Management, where he recently was selected as one of the 100 most inspirational alumni in the school's history. I'll turn the screen now to Gil Penalosa.
Mute? Okay. Thank you. Half of the homes that will be in the world, in the cities, in 40 years, do not exist today. Half of the homes. Today, we have about 3.5 billion people living in cities. Within the lifetime of our students, our children, we're going to go to 7 billion people. And it could be very nice. How do we want to live? We need to decide that, because we could have walkable and bikeable and public transit, and we could have parks and nature for all. It's up to all of us. It's a great opportunity that we have, but also a huge responsibility, because whatever we do or don't do is how people are going to live for hundreds of years. So if this is going to happen in the next 40 years, let's see what we have done in the last 40. This is what we've been doing. This is how we've been doing cities, segregating, sending the poor people to the worst places where there is no parks and no public transit. Even in the wealthiest country in the world, the US, this is by postal code. The postal code in dark red, the life expectancy is 60. Few minutes away on light pink is 90. We've been focusing on cars and not on people's happiness. And this is how we've been doing cities and trying to solve mobility, investing billions, and we haven't even solved mobility. So cities, they don't decide the what, the amount of population, that's at the national level, but the cities do decide the how. And this is how we've been doing cities. No trees, no parks. Actually, instead of parks, we've been doing parking lots for cars. Imagine the small children, the elderly, people with disabilities. So the last 40 years have been horrible, most of it. A little bit okay, and very few isolated, like with acupuncture, actually is good. So we need to change. We need to improve the cities that we have today. But we also need to create many great cities for many, many more people. We need to do it radically different. And actually, we need to do it. Habitat, UN Habitat is very close to my heart because in 1976, the UN Habitat Conference on Human Settlements took place in Vancouver. And my father was in charge of it. As Undersecretary General of the UN, he organized it. And I was only ending high school and beginning university. But I remember that at that time, they were also talking about pollution, and they were talking about sprawling cities and slums. And not much has been done to really transform it. The good news is that the population is not growing anymore. So almost very little, and it's going to stabilize in 2050, 2060. But and so I want to talk about this. It doesn't matter if the city is 2,000 people or 5 million or 10 million. The issues are similar. The solutions are different. All of us are going through public health crisis, private crisis of equity, population growth. We're living longer everywhere. Climate change. The symptoms are everywhere, even if some people still don't want to believe in it. And when we were dealing with all of these issues, COVID arrived. And when COVID arrived, some people say all change. I don't think all change. I think that the perception changed. It's like if we had a magnifying glasses and all of a sudden we saw equity. We see people asking to sleep on parking lots, physically separated, while 90% of the hotel rooms are empty. And also good news is that we saw how the quality of the air changed when there were fewer cars. So are we gonna go back to that? We gotta focus on health, on equity, on sustainability. We have a huge opportunity and responsibility. Some people say, oh, it's gonna be easy to change because this one runs on money and makes you fat. This one runs on fat and saves you money. And now we're gonna do parks and trees. Unfortunately, it's not gonna be that easy. There's lots of forces of people that wanna be more segregated, more car-oriented. So we need to be very loud and very clear and very active, or it might be worse than what we had before. How do we want to live? We need a shared vision. How do we want cities to become? In some ways, we need to jump over COVID, our minds, and we need to change the way of doing things. The goal is to create cities that are equitable and sustainable, and people live healthier and happier. So I want to have 4 messages in the last 5 minutes that I have. First, let's do parks for people. Great parks are great if people visit, they stay, and they come back. It's not if they win awards. Should we have small or large parks? We should have both because they satisfy very different needs. We need to have citywide park systems. Everybody in the world should have a park within a short walk. I mean, again, in the US, in the wealthiest country, 100 million people living in cities. 1 out of 3 citizens do not have a park within walking distance. I invite everybody to work on a campaign, 10, 20, 30. What is 10, 20, 30? Everybody has to have a park within a 10-minute walk by 2030. Everybody. So let's start building parks everywhere we don't have parks. And if we don't have a park, let's think of things that belong to us, the street, the schools, the libraries, and let's turn this pavement into wonderful parks. All of that is doable. 30% of the area of the cities are streets. Let's take our streets and make them play streets and parks. Sidewalks, nothing more important in cities than sidewalks. That is where we develop a sense of belonging. People meet boyfriends and girlfriends. That's the life. We use them in the summer. We use them in the winter. Children catch Pokemons. We take public transit. So the sidewalks are really, really critical in everywhere. It's not just to move from point A to point B. It's the life of the cities. The sidewalks are reminders that walking is much more than walking. Sidewalks are almost part of the family of parks. 2, we gotta have nature everywhere, everywhere. Nature everywhere is gonna be good for culture, for education, for recreation. I mean, almost for everything, health and well-being and economic development. We need to have healthier lifestyles. We gotta have farmers markets in all neighborhoods, the rich and the poor and everywhere. We need to have urban gardening. We need to remind people that tomatoes don't come out of factories. But there is no health without mental health. Depression today is the world's leading cause of disabilities. If we have contact with nature, it's going to improve our mood, our cognitive attention. So that's why we got to have green spaces and nature everywhere, whether it's in Puerto Rico or in Alaska or wherever we are in Africa, nation, Latin America. We got to have green neighborhoods. We need to have nature at home, on the sidewalks, on the schools, on the parks, in the places of work. Number 3, let's focus on the vulnerable people. I mean, when we evaluate cities, let's evaluate cities on how do we treat as most vulnerable people? Who are the most vulnerable? By age, the children and the elderly, but also everyone that is poor, the people that have disabilities, the people from racial minorities or ethnic minorities, and in many places, women. So these are the vulnerable people that we need to focus. That has to be our priority, to evaluate if neighborhoods, if cities, if countries are good or bad. As an example, children and older adults. Our cities should have playability everywhere. Our children should be able to play on the sidewalks, on the parks, and this isn't cost a lot of money. It's just changing our mindsets about the playability. And some people might say it's great because it's fun and games. But in addition to fun and games, playing is how children learn. Playing is how children develop their muscle strength, their sociability, their friendship. I mean, if we improve the beginning, we're going to improve their lives. So it's critical. These are going to be our future city builders. And also we're living longer, not longer, much, much longer. Older people are enjoying gardening and eating ice cream and time with their grandchildren. All around the world, the population over 60 is going to double. The population over 80 is going to quadruple. In rich countries, in poor countries, in large ones, in small ones. The older people could be fantastic assets to a community. They are givers. They are not takers. So let's engage. Let's make sure that older people have a much healthier and happier life. It's totally doable, but we got to focus on that. How do we build the parks, the activities that we do? How do we connect intergenerations, grandparents and grandchildren, and great-great-grandparents and grandchildren? And the last message is that we got to change. If we really want to create cities that are equitable and sustainable, if we want to have people that are living happier and healthier, and change, why don't we change? Because change is hard. Doing more of the same is easier. Change is not unanimous. So let's not wait for unanimity. The general interest must prevail over the particular. And let's remember, the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. It could be huge. These are not technical issues. The solutions exist. These are not financial. We have the money, but we're investing in widening highways and so on. This is political. It's about policy, but not political parties. All political parties should be about these issues that improve people's lives. This is with a big P. Everybody needs to participate. We gotta be bold. We gotta build alliances with the schools and the businesses and the private and the public sector. We need to develop a sense of urgency, because from a horrible moment, we can develop a great opportunity. We have seen how with fewer cars, people are building corridors for bicycles all over the world. And we have also seen how in some places they are taking over the streets and creating places like parks for people, from Auckland, New Zealand to Oakland, California. And they are creating bus lanes for BRTs and markets on the streets and golf courses being turned into parks, because in a golf course, you have 200 people playing. In a park, you got thousands and thousands. You can also do housing in the same place. So what seemed impossible became possible. And we are happy. But let's remember, these are very, very few cities that are actually transforming. Everybody's talking about the new normal. Very few are actually doing. And so we need to have a shared vision, but vision alone is not efficient. We need to have lots and lots of action. And shared vision and lots of action are going to end with creating cities that are equitable and sustainable, people that live healthier and happier. And we can move from talking to doing. So planners, let's do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil. I think you've sort of matched, I guess, my experience with your work in the past. Very passionate and visionary. And I really like your focus on the need for action. I think many of us, most of us know what needs doing. The trick is to actually make it happen, particularly those of us on city councils and in organizations like that have real decision-making power. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation here, is Mosley Duhoki. Mosley is the president of Duhok University, or has been the president since 2012. During his academic career, he has served at different universities in the Kurdistan region under different academic titles. In 2016, he was elected as a member of the board of directors at the International Association of Universities. Mr. Duhoki.
I think we lost him.
You can go to the next one then.
Yes, go ahead, Reed. You can introduce Martina.
Okay. Our next presenter, this is actually a video. The video is prepared by Martina Otto, who is the head of cities at the United Nations Environmental Program. She leads UN Environment's work on cities and multi-level policy integration. Her areas of expertise include sustainable energy, transport, buildings, climate change, air quality, and sustainable consumption and production, among others.
Join the second Urban Economy Forum. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, cities are at the front line of COVID-19, both in terms of impact and response. Vibrant hubs of global and local exchange, cities have been particularly hard hit, with some 90% of all reported cases recorded in cities. At the same time, cities are responsible for much of the key infrastructure, keeping things going. But we've seen impacts, for example, on waste management, with the increases in medical waste and setbacks in waste collection, recycling, and single-use plastic bans. Public transport saw a decline, which has impacts on profitability and the variability to provide this critical service. Cities have reacted with pop-up bike lanes, now turning them into more permanent structures. Cities have also provided public space for markets, allowing farmers to get their produce to consumers and consumers to purchase food while keeping the required physical distancing. Even before the pandemic, we knew that local government had tasks that were often not commensurate with the institutional and financial capacity. Now, revenues will be down by an estimated 15 to 25%. At the same time, we have also seen that where there is cooperation and greater alignment between the different levels of government, responses are more effective. And this is not only true for the pandemic response, but also for other emergencies, such as the climate emergency. Cities are responsible already today for some 75% of greenhouse gas emissions and resource use. With increasing levels of urbanization, this is set to increase. And this is why strong local leadership and integrated urban planning are key to driving down these numbers. Density is key to reducing climate and resource footprints and run efficient public services. But it's that very density of cities that has been under scrutiny due to COVID-19. Yet studies have shown that density is not the issue. Overcrowding is, and pre-existing vulnerability in terms of health and living conditions. We call for strategic density, which allows for efficiencies and a human scale with increased livability. short enough distances between living and working space to walk and cycle, and access green space. More streets than roads for more economic and social interactions. Density is not a fixed number, but context specific, and it is not uniform across the entire city, and it's not necessarily meaning high rise. But what it does require is good urban planning. Planning that factors in sector integration, particularly between energy, transport, and buildings, to bring the energy and transport transition to life, with buildings as the logical connecting points. For example, using roofs for on-site renewable energy generation and integrating e-mobility and storage capacity. The International Resource Panel, in its report Weight of Cities, found that with integrated planning, sector and cross-sector optimization towards greater circularity, as well as behavioral change, 35 to 55% of greenhouse gas emission and resource use reduction are possible. Cities have a critical role in driving circularity, and the UN Secretary General's brief, COVID in an Urban World, highlighted that keeping products and materials for as long as possible and at the highest value possible in the economic cycle does provide a huge opportunity for shorter value chains with local job creation and allowing cities to reconnect with their surrounding areas. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming together today when we celebrate World Habitat Day, which focuses this year on housing for all. And who would have thought that this year's focus would be so timely in a world where half of the population is living under some form of restriction, and our apartments have transformed into schools and offices. And we have been so painfully reminded how important our homes are. COVID-19 clearly came on top of a housing crisis, and inequalities in access to adequate housing have increased the vulnerability. We need to provide housing for all. And I think particularly of the 1.8 billion people that are living in slums and informal settlements, in inadequate housing or in homelessness. This is why buildings and construction has to be a cornerstone in building back better strategies and recovery packages. And I have a second reason for this inclusion, and that is that building renovation in particular provides huge job opportunities. Analysis suggests that around 60% of expenditure on home energy efficiency retrofits does go towards labor. Between 9 and 30 jobs are created for every $1 million invested in energy efficiency measures in the building sector. And the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, whose secretariat I'm heading as well as leading UNEP's work on cities, is calling for a global renovation wave, spurred by upgrade programs that provide incentives to roll out sustainable solutions to existing buildings at scale. I also have a third reason, and that is it makes financial sense too. For example, more than $11 billion in stimulus funding was made available for building upgrade programs in the United States from 2009 to 2011, after the last financial crisis, targeting homes, businesses, government buildings, and other public facilities such as schools and hospitals. These programs delivered about $2 in energy cost savings for every dollar invested. And there is a fourth reason. Per the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction Global Status Report, which comes out annually, the sector currently is responsible for almost 40% of energy and process-related greenhouse gas emissions. And the mere fact that floor space is expected to double between now and 2050, translating into adding the floor space equivalent to the size of a Paris every week, means that if we do not look at building design, the materials that are used, energy consumption, and beyond the single building, how buildings connect to their ecosystem, meaning the neighborhoods and the city, we will not be able to make this sector Paris compliant. COVID-19 has shown us, if we're not prepared, a crisis hits us harder. And we're already witnessing growing climate change-induced heat waves, both in frequency and amplitude. Rising temperatures mean that 1.6 billion people could face average summer temperature highs of 35 degrees by 2050, approximately 1.4 billion people more than today. And this severely affects the functioning and the health of cities and their citizens. Space cooling already today is amongst the fastest growing building end users of energy. Meeting the cooling demand with power-hungry air conditioning means that this cooling is pumping out excess heat and greenhouse gas emissions, which both further warm the planet and so lead to an ever increase of the need for cooling. Cities all over the world have started to take action. And I have 3 examples. Following the 2010 heat wave, Ahmedabad in India developed a plan for cool roofs, awareness raising, and cooling stations. This has allowed the city to avoid over 1,000 deaths per year since 2013. Melbourne, Australia is banking on nature-based solutions. The goal is to plant 3,000 trees, which provide shade, reflect sunlight, and release moisture into the air through their leaves, and thereby cool the city by 4 degrees. Copenhagen, Denmark uses seawater in its district cooling system, reducing CO2 emissions by up to 30,000 tons per year, and is promoting green roofs for municipal buildings. Let's prepare and attach green strings to recovery packages to make the most of the funds that are being pumped into getting our economies back and keeping jobs. And all this by future-proofing these investments, making our built environment zero carbon. In conclusion, avoiding a return to the pre-pandemic status quo, and instead reforming and transforming cities globally for future resilience, inclusion, green and economic sustainability has never been more urgent. Cities have a critical role to play, from integrating environment into cities' long-term strategies, into urban planning, using their authority over land use, to implementing building codes, and through their own procurement decisions. But let's be clear, with all the leadership demonstrated by local leaders, cities cannot do it alone, and we need to enhance local government budgetary capacity with policy measures and dedicated funds in the stimulus packages. Of course, all this with green strings attached. Thank you.
I'm not sure she'll ever receive this, but I'd like to thank Marina for that presentation. It certainly spoke to me, comments like the need for strategic density and the importance of renovating to anticipate the need to deal with climate change. And it linked back, I thought, nicely to Gil Penalosa's comment that basically our cities are going to double in the next 40 years. And so what kind of housing are we going to be building, and what will be the impact on climate change of that housing? So I think it all links together quite nicely. Our next presentation is also a video from Michael Brooks. Michael is the CEO of RealPAC here in Canada. He's responsible for the association's strategic planning, policy formulation, government relations, and national and international liaison with associations in the USA, UK, Asia, and Australia. Michael has been the driving force behind the development of the RealPAC sustainability platform.
Thanks, Reed. Everybody hear me okay? All good? All good. Thank you, Kumaresh. And good morning, everybody. I had pre-recorded this because I wasn't sure about availability, but it's been such a great event so far, learning so much from everybody. I'm really pleased. And so I'm forgetting my pre-recording. I'm just going to do this again. So good day to everyone. And Reed, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm also coming to you from Markham, Ontario, Canada. Today, I'm going to talk about rental housing in Canada and how the institutional residential landlords fared during COVID to date, and the importance of institutional and private capital in the future of housing. There's not too many people from the private sector in this conference, which is great for me, but it's also highlights the importance of understanding money and how you can harness private capital for solving the problems, many of the problems that you've mentioned. I'm a planner. My undergrad degree is in planning, my PhD is in planning, and I have a business degree somewhere in between. I tell people that when you graduate from planning school, you're a socialist. When you graduate from business school, you're a capitalist. The real world is somewhere in between. Both sides have to work together to solve housing problems. And certainly policymakers have to understand how private markets work everywhere in the world. As Reid mentioned, our members include the biggest pension funds in Canada, fund managers, public REITs and real estate operating companies, large private companies, all asset classes, probably around $1 trillion Canadian in assets under management. So call this professional global real estate. And the people behind these organizations are pensioners and people who rely on the income, people who need dividends for their retirement. And what they get with these institutional capital companies is professional management, accountability, regulatory oversight, and access to asset classes they otherwise could not afford directly. I can't afford to buy an office building, but I've got a lot of ways to the public markets and through my pension company to have a piece of a large portfolio of office buildings. Now, rental accommodation. About 40% of Canadians live in rented accommodation. This is all types. This is basement apartments, boarding houses to high-rise glass condo towers. They're in every municipality. Some people rent by necessity, some by choice, some it has to do with their phase in life, some to do with not being tied down, some like the freedom and low maintenance. Some are not sure where they want to settle and when they want to settle. And probably all of us have been renters at some point. Our members own about 10% of the institutional grade apartment market in Canada, so maybe 5% of the total market, which includes the basement apartments, et cetera. So our members are about 240,000 rental units nationally, and actually many more around the world. Our pension funds own apartments in many countries on the planet. The large majority of people who own rental accommodation are small investors. For them, it's an opportunity to get ahead, to be an entrepreneur, to invest in something tangible and real that they can improve over time. And as our Canadian government likes to say, a way to join the middle class. So in Canada, we're 6 months into this pandemic, and at its worst point, 9 million Canadians out of a population of some 37 took some kind of government subsidy. Obviously, government had a dilemma. How do you keep people in their homes? Because for those kind of numbers, the consequences can be drastic. And I can tell you that institutional owners of rental apartments accommodated those unable to pay rent that they could deal with. That's the benefit of having deep pockets and an institutional capital sector. Most of you will know that governments around the world enacted a residential evictions moratorium, including every province in Canada. For most of them, that evictions moratorium was 3 months, for some longer. So no courts, no process, no evictions carried out. And the early repercussions of that were actually good, as I mentioned, for many of our owners dealing with rental accommodation for those unable to pay who'd lost their jobs or underemployed. We did have some bad actors taking advantage because, hey, if you can't throw me out of my rental unit, then I'm just not going to pay rent, whether or not I still have a job. Institutional landlords, I would say, were less concerned about those unable to pay than how do you deal with the bad actors in your apartment building? How do you deal with violence on site, drug dealing, assault, damage to premises and vandalism? How do you deal with that when you cannot evict anybody? How do you keep your other tenants safe? Some jurisdictions did allow for those types of breaches to be subject to eviction. Most didn't in our research. And apartment owners were certainly urged by the local premiers to be accommodative of those tenants unable to pay rent or else. And then that messaging slowly changed to, if you can pay your rent, you should do so. So that seemed to politically moderate over the time. The data was actually pretty good for these last 6 months. Over the 160,000 units nationally that we surveyed monthly, the national delinquency rate in August was only 4.4%, again, in my institutional sector, down from a high of 8.6% who were behind in their rent in April, and down from 6% in June. And we're currently surveying to see what the total bad debt carried forward is. And landlords actually in September and October now are actually seeing increased vacancies in some cities, people moving home and leaving apartments, Airbnb units coming back on the long-term market. Immigration is way down in Canada right now. Foreign students leaving and not returning. So the voluntary forbearance of rent early in the pandemic has turned into rent concessions later in the pandemic. 90% of our institutional owner members reduced their asking rents in July, and a further 75% reduced their asking rents in August. The average reduction in rent was 6.4% in July and 6% in August. And that's a survey of over 150,000 units. 70% of landlords were offering 1 month free in July, 63% in August, and only 0.8% of all of these tenants were on some kind of a rent deferral program with their landlord as at the end of August. And despite media coverage, the number of free riders, the people I mentioned early, continues to be very, very low on a national scale. And as I mentioned, the larger institutional companies can afford to wait these people out and spread out bad debt losses. So the financialized residential rental market provides professional management, no failures in 6 months, safe income to pensioners, investors, everybody behind them, and responsible governance to the sector while complying with pandemic laws during a very difficult period to date. There's 2 complaints about financialized owners. One is the move-in evictions in the condo rental market in Canada, or fake move-in evictions. In the purpose-built rental market, there's no title to individual units. So there's no upside for an institutional owner to ever do that owner eviction approach. The renoviction doesn't apply in the purpose-built market at all. When that unit becomes vacant, most owners will renovate the unit. New fridge, stove, have a look at the carpet, paint the walls. And that's a feature. That's not a bug of the system. And it's the only way in many cases the landlord can match cost inflation in rent controlled environments. So it makes sure that maintenance is kept up to date, and that's super important for most renters in this country. So affordable housing, we need a much more nuanced approach to affordable housing in this country than we have. The Netherlands and countries in Europe have a much better approach to this than we currently do in this country. And I often tell people about an analogy of the river. Money is a river. It starts with the tenant, it goes to the owner, it pays property taxes to municipalities, utilities, employees, staff, mortgage company, and then it flows down to the next branch in that tree. It goes to the mortgage company who pay the same kind of things. It goes to investors who pay taxes. So that money is a river. And if you dam the money up at the front end, everybody downstream suffers. So the river is the way I approach all of this issue. So let me finish with this. Adding capital to the apartment market is crucial to the future of this sector around the world. Private capital is your friend. Institutional capital is your friend. Tell it where to go, give it the ground rules, and it will perform. Let it earn a return for everybody behind it down the river. And I think that because of that, governments everywhere should be enabling financialization of rental accommodation, whether it's REITs in Germany that fund apartments in Germany or anywhere else in the world. It's a positive force for change. And more Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, less Karl Marx. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Speaking from the Markham perspective, I think affordable housing is a crisis, or the lack of affordable housing is a crisis in this city, certainly. And I think that that's true in virtually every major center in Canada and much of the Western world, I suspect. And it's going to take a whole range of different solutions to address it. And clearly the private for purpose-built rental solution is part of that puzzle, an important piece of that puzzle, and it's something that's been missing here in the market here in Canada for probably 30 years or more, and I think it's only now sort of coming back, and that's very much to be welcomed. So certainly here in Markham, we look forward to working with your members to improve the availability of purpose-built rental for sure. We do now have with us Mosley Duhoki, and if you'll bear with me, I'll repeat the introduction to him. He is the president of Duhok University and has been since 2012. During his academic career, he has served at different universities in the Kurdistan region under different academic titles. In 2016, he was elected member of the board of directors of the International Association of Universities. And I'm sure I've butchered his the pronunciation of his name, but welcome, Mr. Duhoki.
Okay. Good morning again, and sorry that I had a problem in internet connection. Actually, it is my pleasure to take part in this important forum whose aim is to shed light on key principles and strategies for the most innovative, sustainable urban development solutions. Number one, the UN Sustainable Development Goal, SDGs, as guidelines, the solutions to sustainable urban development, that is the planned and continuous effort, governmental and otherwise, made to remove the obstacles that stand in the way of realizing the SUD goals, which are to be in the light of the followings. A, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2015 in general, and B, the SDG 11, which is concerned with making cities and human settlements safe, resilient, and sustainable in particular. Making cities sustainable means access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services. Access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport system. Paying special attention to the air quality and municipal and other waste management. Universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces. The content of this quotation involves in particular the following three sustainable urban development pillars. First, investment in public transport, investment in public educational and health institutions, investment in the creation of an integrated solid waste management system, investment in the creation of an integrated wastewater management system, and investment in the creation of green public spaces within the city. Second, improving urban planning and management machinery in the participatory and in a inclusive way. And third, a proper budgeting, that is making available to the local governmental bodies concerned and others the necessary yearly finance needed to achieve what is specified in the above two pillars. Moreover, the city's yearly budget, as it is the case with the governorates and the national budget, must be a budget of priorities, a budget of targets, a budget of programs, and a budget of the result with independent accountability. SDGs and rapid population growth, the case of Iraq. The SDGs in general and the SDG 11 in particular did tackle indirectly the problem of rapid growth of cities due to rapid natural population growth on the one hand and an increasing migration on the other. This is exactly the case of Iraq today, as it had been during the development decades of the past century from early 50s to early 70s. According to UNDP 2018, the annual growth rate of Iraqi population over the period 2015 to 2020 has been estimated at 2.8%. This means that in 24-year time, starting with 2019, if this annual growth rate were to remain at 2.8% as mentioned, the Iraqi population size would double from 39 million in 2019 to 78 million in 2043. Needless to add that rapid population growth on the national, regional, and city levels necessitates among three things, and the things are the following. A, rapid increase in the number of households per families. B, rapid increase in residential units. And C, rapidly increasing labor force, thus an increasing need for large-scale job creation. Number three, SUGS and dependence of the Iraqi national budget on crude oil exports. The second serious obstacle that stands in the way of planning for the shifting realization of SDG 11 and the SDGs in general is oil dependence. In this respect, we have for decades the unhealthy economic situation in which the proceeds of the Iraqi exports of goods and services are dominated by the proceeds of the exports of crude oil. Recent OPEC data suggests that the dollar value of Iraqi crude oil export is generally more than 90% of total value of all Iraqi yearly exports. On the other hand, generally, oil revenues dominate the revenues of the yearly national budget of Iraq. For example, oil revenues account for more than 85% of the Iraqi national budget for the fiscal year 2019. Continued and rapid population growth coupled with oil dependence and sustainable urban development are incompatible. Iraq on the city level, the governorate level, the regional level, and the national level is witnessing such a state of affairs. No doubt, the responsibility for controlling the current population explosion in Iraq on the national, regional, and city level lays with the Iraqi families, the Iraqi universities, and the availability of family planning clinics on the one hand, and on the commitment of the local, regional, and central governments to a serious family planning program, with a clear view of the zero option growth on the other. On the other hand, and an increasing oil dependence, financing the various programs, including the required comprehensive family planning program based on the zero growth option, that are consistent with SDGs in general and SDG 11 in particular, requires that the official elite class on the municipality level, the governmental level, the regional level, and on the national level accept and show the following constructive attitudes. Transparent resources of revenues, both from crude oil export and from all forms of domestic resources. B, budget local, governorate, regional, and national are based on clear priorities, targets, programs, and budget of result with independent accountability. C, transparency in the use of the budgeted finances allocated for the various sustainable urban development program within the guidelines of SDG 11. And D, accepting the work of the specialized and independent technical bodies, domestic and from example, the UN, whose main task is evaluation of result and submission of specific and applicable recommendations. Given that, then UN and other sponsored financial and technical help may be requested. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dahoki. We're running a little bit behind, so in the interest of time, we'll wrap up this session now, and I'll turn the screen back over to, I'm not sure, to Alex, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
So yes, Reed is correct. We are about 5 minutes behind. That's not too bad. So we will not have a break, and we'll move immediately into the sessions. If you were here yesterday, the way this will work is my colleague Evan will open a breakout room. He will send everyone to that breakout room. Everyone, please hit accept. Once you have accepted, you can then freely move in between both breakout rooms. So this main room will be theme 4, session 1, urban transformation. And then the other breakout room will be theme 5, session 1, urban economy, housing, and real estate, which will be curated by Sonia Skinner.
Sorry, just a point for clarification. So everyone will receive an offer to move to the breakout room. So if you're participating for theme 4 session 1, please say no to that offer and then just stay in this room. But if you're participating for theme 5 session 1, which will be held in the second room that we'll create, please say yes to the offer, and then it will automatically transfer. And another note that I want to bring up is that if you want to move between rooms, click the breakout rooms button at the bottom beside share screen or closed caption and so on. And then it will allow you to move between the rooms. And once you're in the breakout room, and if you want to move to the other room, press the end button at the top, at the bottom right. But when you press it, don't end the meeting, just end the breakout room, and it will bring you back to the main room. And then that's how you can navigate, maneuver between back and forth between the two rooms. So that process will happen right now. And if you have any questions, me and Alex will be able to help you with that.